Good day to both of you. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm going to start with you, William, in New York. These protests have spread to a number of cities. Could you just give us what's happening now and how many cities are actually affected?
Yeah, absolutely. First, in terms of a national perspective, it's estimated that 40 cities around the United States currently have some form of curfew measure in place. That's really affecting 15 states here in the US. Now, here in New York City, we do not have curfew measures in place, despite a night that saw plenty of looting. You can see behind me, this store was one of those that was victim to looting. Now, this is a common sight where I am in the Soho neighborhood, a popular shopping district, of course, here in Manhattan. Now, we've heard from both the governor of New York State, Andrew Cuomo, and New York City's Mayor Bill de Blasio. They say they'll be in discussions whether to impose a curfew here in New York City. The message from the mayor is that there's both pros and cons to going forward with such a move. The governor also saying that there is the possibility of the National Guard if they so decide to, but no firm action regarding those two measures being taken as of yet.
And I understand that Bill de Blasio's daughter was arrested in the protest as well.
That's absolutely right. She was arrested in Union Square in Manhattan on 14th Street, which is one of the biggest areas of protest. Of course, here in the city, there have been protests across a number of all 5 boroughs here in the city. And the mayor's daughter was arrested, according to reports. Now, the mayor has faced criticism from both sides of the fence, both being seen as too pro-policing when it comes to their response to a few shocking videos that have emerged. Protesters also saying that he's been too lenient on the NYPD. So the mayor is certainly very much front and centre during these protests, as we have seen. So too is his family as well.
And let's move over to the West Coast. Our Los Angeles correspondent, Danielle Robertson. State of emergency in California over this, but are the scenes as intense as we've seen in New York, for example?
The scenes in Los Angeles have turned chaotic. Most of the protests during this week, in fact, yesterday was the 5th day of unrest in this state. They've started out peaceful and quickly descended into chaos as night fell. Most of the people here began these protests by saying they want justice for George Floyd. But once the National Guard was deployed to this state, that was something that was issued by the California governor, that's when things really started to heat up. We had them arrive here yesterday, but by that stage, it was a little bit too late. The damage had already been done. What we're seeing now is this shift between protesters who are wanting justice and who are calling for change within the justice system in America to people who are now heading out and looting a number of stores. This morning across Los Angeles, parts of the city have been left in ruins, and it doesn't look like there is going to be reprieve today. There's been about 400 people arrested just yesterday. There's been more than 1,000 people arrested across the entire week. Police officers have been injured. There was, in fact, one police officer who had a brick thrown at his head. He had a fractured skull and he had to go to hospital. The scenes really did start to ramp up into the night, and the anger here really just turned into destruction. The calls for justice turned into looting, arson and anarchy. But along with the protesters who are heading out and looting these stores, there are also the ones that were here for the original purpose of George Floyd. And this morning and yesterday morning, they headed out and they started scrubbing off all the graffiti that had been vandalised from the night before. But as the protesters who were scrubbing off the graffiti try and clean up the mess and business owners return to their livelihoods to find it vandalised, other protesters are heading out once again for another day of chaos.
And what leadership has President Donald Trump provided at this very fractious time, Danielle?
Yeah, it's really interesting. The leadership here has been under criticism across the United States. President Donald Trump has been bunkered down. He was put in a safe place across Friday and Sunday night. He did address the states during a teleconference, and he said and urged people to use the National Guard if they are on the ground to try and gain control. He has been very critical of the response from all the governors across the country, and he has said that he wanted to use Antifa, which is the anti anti-fascist and anarchist activists. He said he wanted to deploy that. He's really distinguishing this, and sort of critics are saying he's creating more of a divide because he's distinguishing the entire protests as, you know, this is an act of terrorism rather than trying to call for a time of unity. Now, we haven't really heard much from Donald Trump. Usually he's very active on Twitter, very loud. He has been active on Twitter, but not as much as he usually is. He is sheltering in place, and as the United States erupts in violence, people, you know, at this time are looking for leadership to show unity. And across the nation, the United States really has this long history ingrained with racial tensions. For example, in Los Angeles, there was a Rodney King riots of 1992 where police officers were acquitted of the beating of Rodney King, and that erupted into major riots across Los Angeles. Between then and now, in 1992 to now, 28 years later, the sentiment is still felt, and they feel like people, they're just not being heard. There is fear and anger, and people can't look to Trump for some advice at the moment. He's still sheltering in place. We may hear from him later in this week, but he is really creating this divide between anarchists and why the protests began in the first place.
William, back to you in New York. This has become now a global protest. We are seeing that top sports people, celebrities as well, are adding their voice, saying this is unacceptable. Just tell us a little bit about these protests as they gain momentum globally.
Absolutely. We heard from the governor of New York, who spoke to what we've been seeing as the increased looting in a number of major cities, like here in New York and as well in Los Angeles. And the message from Governor Cuomo is that people shouldn't be watching the videos of looting. They should still be watching the video of George Floyd as he was taken into police custody. He said it's important that the movement created since the death of George Floyd isn't hijacked by these small pockets of looters and the small pockets of violence that we've seen in cities like here in New York. And of course, that video from George Floyd has sparked condemnation around the world. Of course, we've seen protests in the likes of London and Trafalgar Square on Sunday. We've seen protests in Berlin, in Scandinavia, as well as far as Auckland, New Zealand as well. So we've just seen how this has resonated globally. And of course, this all comes from the fact that the world is still very much battling a global COVID-19 pandemic. The governor, again, addressing this on Monday, he said that it is a concern. This comes just a week before New York City is set to begin its phase 1 reopening. The message, though, is that there are concerns that there could be spreaders of the disease at these mass protests. The message is that people absolutely have the right to demonstrate and get these important views heard, but the message from officials is they do that safely.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, our New York correspondent William Denzilo and our Los Angeles correspondent Daniel Robertson giving us an update there. And yes, certainly watching some of the protests yesterday, while some people were wearing masks, there was not much social distancing happening.